Okay, so we're going to move on now to looking at my top tips for demonstrating in practicals. So my first one is that it's important to focus students on the aims of the session. So usually this would be after the lab convener had done an introductory talk. So I would gather students around the front of the bench and say, okay, these are the things that you need to learn by the end of the session. So it might be that you have to decide what the important things are from the lab practical handbook, or it might be that you have to rephrase it a little bit to make it more relevant and understandable for students. But it's useful to make them focus on the purpose of the practical. It's also very useful in that you can call students around to the front of the desk and say, without actually saying anything, I am in charge. I will be guiding you through this practical. Listen to me. So obviously, it's important to discuss things with the group as a whole. It can be a very efficient way of saving time, gathering everybody around and talking through things, because it means you don't have to go around individually and pass that information onto each member of the group. So if all students were busy working at microscopes and you've realised there's an important piece of information, you can simply say, excuse me, can I have your attention? I would like to share this with you. And that's one way of discussing things with the group. It can also be useful in that whilst one student might not be able to answer a question, as a group they're likely to have a wider level of knowledge, so they'll be able to come up with the answer together, perhaps. My next tip is to also talk to individuals and pairs. So it's important to go round and ask people how they're doing, what stage they are as in the experiment, what answers they gave for certain things, to assess their progress and their level of understanding. My next top tip is to use visual examples as much as possible, so to not simply expect them to read their handbooks or verbally explain something. Often it is better to let them see a technique being done itself. So Confucius says, tell me and I'll forget, show me and I'll remember, involve me and I'll understand. So what we would like to do is to involve them as much as possible. So if, for example, you're thinking about demonstrating a specific bit of the locus dissection, instead of calling them around and saying, right, watch me do this, what you could do is call them around and say, right, I'd like a volunteer. I'm going to verbally guide you through how to do this part of the dissection. And that makes it quite interesting and motivating for students, and it tells them, I'm in charge here. My next tip is that it's very important to keep track of time. Now, often this is done by the lab convener, but it's also important for you to keep a track of time as well. Students will work at different speeds. There'll be some who go through very quickly, but there'll always be some who find it very hard to move on to the next question before they've fully answered the first question. But in a practical, that might mean that they lose out, because the first 50% of marks are usually very easy to get, whereas the last 50% are usually very, very difficult. So it would be a far more effective use of their time if they were to answer all questions, as opposed to spending all their time answering the first half of the questions. It can be very useful to break complex tasks down into achievable steps. And this is something that you might want to consider during your preparation. So, for example, this is a question that the first years would get in their first semester, and it's a mathematical calculation, but that is quite daunting for a lot of first year biological sciences students, and they would need additional support for it. So what you could do is break it down into a sequence of stages. How many cells in 1 microliter, in 1 litre, in the entire blood volume. And that can often guide students through the calculation. So this leads on to the idea of asking questions but not giving answers. So are closed questions a good idea? To which you should all reply no. And that of course is an example of a closed question. And students can very easily reply yes or no without having any understanding of the question itself or the topic. But could you describe another type of question? Requires students to give a longer answer and to demonstrate a level of understanding. So I particularly like an idea of Socratic questioning. And Socrates used to guide his students towards discovering their own answers by a sequence of leading questions. And learning in this way is a very powerful method. So it might be to break tasks down into steps. So that could be chronological, where you ask what happens first, what happens next. Or it might be asking what, who, when, how, why, and going through a sequence of questions like that. Or you can encourage critical thinking by using this technique, which is called Socratic Questioning. And it basically says that questions are grouped into 6 different categories. And this is something that I use to develop my own critical analysis, and you would probably benefit from by applying this to your PhDs. And what you can do is say, okay, I'm going to look at the types of questions I ask already. And you'll find that you do ask some of these automatically, but you might find that there are certain areas that you're not asking questions for. And then ask yourself, why am I not asking questions in these areas? Would it be useful if I did? So the first category is clarification. And that involves perhaps defining terminology that's being used, or asking for examples to illustrate an idea. Next we have questioning assumptions. So what assumptions have you made and why? Are those assumptions flawed? If they're flawed, what impact does that have on your finding? Now this category people are often quite comfortable with asking questions with, and they will probably do so quite often. So it's questioning the evidence. So okay, this is the scientific experimental result. Does that lead to the conclusion you've drawn? The next category is questioning viewpoints. Okay, so you've put forward this experiment and this conclusion, but is there another way of interpreting that data? Are there other theories that can be applied to this that you haven't discussed? Next, you can consider implications. Now this can be particularly useful in an essay situation when you want to consider how the conclusion you've drawn affects the bigger picture or the research. And lastly, you can ask questions about the question itself. So I've decided on this research topic, but why is it important to investigate this? Might it be important to investigate something else instead? So there's more information on these at this website here. But if you were to type in Socratic questioning on Google, you'd find a wealth of literature about this topic. How can you avoid giving the answer? It can often be quite challenging. So here are some techniques. Can anybody help Bob answer that question? Link it to the lecture. What was said in the lecture about this? Break it down into steps. Now this one's particularly useful. You are becoming experts in academia, and so you'll have developed a lot of academic skills. So you can model how you would go about trying to solve a particular problem. So you might sit down and say, right, let's try and work this one out together. And that can be a very useful way of demonstrating academic skills to another person. And lastly, I have this tip, and it would be to seek advice from and observe your peers, or the demonstrators, or the convener. Watch what they do, talk to them, get support from them. Try and identify what things other people do that seem to work well, or things they do that don't work so well, and how you could improve those or incorporate things in your own teaching.